and welcome to episode 12 of the 39A Podcast. My name is Amrita Ibrahim, and today Project 39A will be discussing crime reporting and the news media in India. I'm joined by Dhanya Rajendran, journalist, founder, and editor in chief of the News Minute, and Hartosh Singh, political editor of the Caravan magazine. I teach anthropology at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., where my areas of research and teaching focus on media, crime, and policing. Thanks to both of you for joining us and welcome. So, to start us off, I'd like to give you both a chance to perhaps introduce some of the listeners of this podcast to the world of crime reporting. Many of them might not actually have any idea about how a journalist enters into that world and how they find their stories, how they set up a relationship with police, investigative agencies, forensic institutions, and so on. So perhaps I could ask Dhanya to start by shedding some light on the typical steps by which a news network throws their journalists into what they call the crime beat.
Hi, Amrita. So, in newspapers, basically, there are different beats, and reporters are assigned to beats. So, in my case, when I joined a newspaper, I was given the crime beat. I have no clue why. I survived on that beat only for 2 or 3 days because I realized that crime beat essentially in a bureau of a newspaper means you go to the police commissioner's office, or you go to the SP's office and you sit there the entire day. They will give you nuggets of what crime has been happening in the city, and if one of those interests you, then maybe you go to the spot. I mean, I'm talking about around 16, 17 years ago when there was no WhatsApp or this kind of messaging where people would just tell you where something is happening and you can immediately rush to a spot. So you wait patiently at the police station or at the commissioner's office and get information. I couldn't survive in that beat because I realized that at that point of time, at least information was trickling in completely through the police. But I don't think things have changed a lot even now. For most crime reporters, their primary source remains to be the police or the investigative agency. It could be the CBI or the NIA or whichever is the agency that that they cover in their beat.
Mhm.
That remains their primary source. But these days I do see journalists making that extra effort to go beyond the source, which is the investigating agency, and to look at another angle, because the investigating agency, after all, is going to tell you only their version of the story, but their version of the story is not complete. In fact, it may not even be true most times. Therefore,
Mhm.
there is definitely an effort by journalists these days, at least I feel, to go beyond that mandate. But that's not a very wide phenomenon, I feel.
Right. Hartosh, you have been in the field of reporting and journalism for a really long time, and you've really seen quite a range in terms of the kinds of stories, both investigative and also within certain organizations that you've been in, where stories have either made absolutely huge headlines and changed how we've thought about crime, changed how we've thought about publicity of crime and criminality. So, what do you see that has changed over the course of your career, if anything, when it comes to crime reporting in India?
So, Amrita, look, my experience has sort of ranged from I started working with a newspaper as a reporter. And while I did not cover the crime beat in a big city like Delhi, where I did for a certain while of time, I was head of the city desk on the editing side, and the crime reporters were reporting to me. But I was a district correspondent in towns in Punjab for about 2 years, Ludhiana and Jalandhar, and crime is a major issue in this
Mm-hmm.
areas and of great interest. And then, of course, I've done weekly and monthly reporting where the nature of stories changes. So, just to add to what Dhanya had said, because I experienced personally how you interact with the police in terms of dealing with crime and how you report on these things in these districts. And of course, you have to build up a network where you are in touch with the police officials, the senior police officials, maybe briefing. But you also build up an informal network within the police, which is not at the top level, which is at the level of somebody posted in a thana somewhere, somebody who you got to know because of constant interaction, people who would tip you off about something that has happened before it is officially declared, may tell you details of the investigation in because of personal interactions that have been built up over a period of time. Of course, there's a give and take. They expect that in some cases you would carry stories favorable to the investigations that we are doing, but that is incumbent on you how you handle that relationship. These informal networks actually form much of the basis for actually reporting crime rather than the official briefings that come with the top level official. So this is the whole process of daily news, where there is a certain give and take, and where the police certainly expects certain things of the reporter in turn as well, and it's up to the reporter to guard against it. And then you step back, and when you're working with a weekly or a monthly organization, then you are doing a deep dive, a longer look, where the daily reporting has already gone past you. And then it becomes a different question of working around the story, of how you deal with people who are survivors of crimes, how you deal with a family, and that becomes a different paradigm altogether.
Right. So my own fieldwork, when I was doing research on with journalists in India about 10 years ago, I found this to be one of the most interesting things about crime reporting, right? Which is this personal relationship that you're talking about. And Dhanya and I have spoken previously, where Dhanya, you've mentioned that this is also quite a misogynist world, where gender plays a very big role in terms of who gets what kinds of stories, or what kind of access you might have, and then also how the story might take shape. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Well, so first to just touch upon what Hartosh was saying, there is of course the formal channel where the police tell you something on record, and there is an informal channel which you build up with a lot of junior officers, or even,
Mhm.
for example, a station writer or a circle inspector or whoever it is. Now, but the problem here still remains that it is their version, right, of a story. Now, for me as an editor of a website, what I started noticing as I started paying more attention to crime copies is that essentially there is a male lens to most of the crime stories being reported from India. I can take a few examples. The story which I was talking to Amrita was about this murder of a man in Tamil Nadu, where all the newspapers had taken an agency copy which said that woman kills her hubby for not being handsome. Therefore, the story becomes viral. More and more people are sharing it because women are shallow according to them, and this woman is more shallow. Therefore, it sort of confirms their biases, and so people share the story. But call to the police station and a few appointed questions, the police will then tell you that uh, the woman was against the marriage. On the first night of the marriage, the man tried to force himself on her, and therefore she murdered him, or at least that's her version of the story. But in your first story, which has already gone out in your newspaper, you have not asked for the other person's version because you are looking at it with a male lens. So I feel a lot of crime reporting in India, in fact, in some of the huge crime stories which Indians have been hooked onto, there's always been that lens. It take any, like for example, Kerala is seeing a lot of dowry harassment deaths recently. Look at how the police have been handling it. When a woman goes to the police station saying that she is being abused for dowry or there is domestic violence, the first instinct of the cop is to basically sort of have a conciliatory meeting or a compromise meeting between the two families, and he behaves as if both the woman and the man are perpetrators. And even while reporting this, despite so much of sensitization, I still feel that many crime reporters do not understand that the police too have to be called out. Or for example, simple stories like a man who's stalking a woman and then kills her. It does not matter if they had a relationship in the past. When the relationship breaks, the man has no business stalking the woman, but when he still does, the newspaper or the website or whatever it is ends up calling him a jilted lover, thereby legitimizing his act of murdering that woman, right? So I feel a lot of crime reporting in India is misogynistic, is patriarchal, and it continues to be so despite people calling out newspapers, websites, television channels, whatever it is.
I think this is the thing that sort of underlies all crime reporting and the interest in crime reporting, which is that essentially it seems to be a lens on the moral fabric, or the ideas of a moral fabric that any society sort of has, right? And it becomes a way to activate a sort of moral policing for the public that is also the consumers of these crime stories. It's something about how the crime both sheds a light on how we think about things like gender and sexuality, and who has autonomy, who has agency of action and things like that, and then how also people might be punished differentially within society or shamed in society differently depending on how these stories are reported, right? And I'm wondering, I find myself very intrigued by this question of why on the one hand there is a great consumption of true crime stories on the one hand, and on the other hand there is this question of how do we sensitize reporters, or how do we train reporters to try to address the biases or the stereotypes that these sorts of stories obviously throw up. So how would you think this could be something that journalism in India could approach? Like, what would be the steps that journalists could take to try to at least educate themselves about these biases, and then go a step further to try to eliminate those biases from their writing and from their reporting?
So, Amrita, look, obviously there is a huge amount of violence. If you actually look at how much of the world's population has spent time through the pandemic, look at what was working, what was streaming online, crime fiction sort of tops the list of what was consumed during this period, and it's true at any other time. And I think all newspaper organizations, media outlets are well aware of the kind of interest that crime generates for obvious reasons. I mean, it is about life, death, emotions, everything that makes us human in some senses, and there is a great deal of interest. But as far as sensitizing reporters to the kind of issues that Dhanya was talking about and other issues that come up, whether in terms of dealing with survivors, victims of assaults, or following court procedures, I think too much onus is placed on individual reporters rather than the institutional framework in which they are working.
Right.
It is for the institution to ensure that the kind of reportage that Dhanya is talking about does not slip through. That if you know that this is the modus under which a newsroom operates, you will find the reporter quickly becoming sensitized to what is happening in the same way that a crime reporter goes out into a world of police persons, which is largely male and has to act in a certain way, which of course closes the door often on female reporters. It is not an easy world to enter, but it is also not always the case. I would point to one of our most important stories, which was the investigation of the death of a judge, Judge Loya, where Nikita Saxena did some of the best stories in terms of the forensics, in terms of the postmortems, dealing with policemen in exactly these situations. So, one is how does the reporter conduct herself outside? The second is what does the reporter bring back and how does the newsroom react to it? If over two or three copies, the issue is pointed out to the reporter, if it is made clear that here is where there's a problem, here is where the lens is wrong, this is not what you're doing, this is what we need to do, this is what you are missing out, and this is the kind of prejudice you're bringing in, the reporter learns.
Right.
And I think the problem in Indian journalism is the failure of institutions to actually do this. So, what we are indicting is not just individual journalists, but the very media setup that goes right up the way to editors to let things like this happen and to let them appear in print or on television.
Right. Would you say that this is something that perhaps could you date it from a particular moment in Indian journalism? Do you think this is a problem that has perhaps always been there?
I mean, in my case, what I would say is that I have seen it wherever I've been through the period. Now I've been in journalism for maybe well over 25 years. I've seen it when I was in the districts. I was looking at the media. You see, a lot of perceptions about crimes are built by the vernacular media in the local cities that we're talking about. We tend to have a very top down view of this. When you are in a place like Ludhiana or Jalandhar and you're looking at what is influencing people's view of crime and how they're consuming crime, you're looking at the Punjab Kesaris, you're looking at the Ajits, you're looking at the Dainik Bhaskars, you're looking at Punjabi, you're looking at Hindi. And this is where you see the issues that I'm talking about are issues of larger structural problems in terms of who is heading these newspapers, the kind of issues they are feeding. And as far as I can see, this was not something that turned at a certain point. Some of the kind of sensationalism that already existed in the vernacular has now also become part of the English media, and certainly of television, prime time, where what would be once considered, if I may, and I'm only using it as an example of a certain kind of a Hindi newspaper splash, has now become prime time material all over the place in all languages.
Right. This is actually the sort of thing that I was investigating in the course of my field work when I was doing research with journalists. And I found that exactly what you're talking about. There is a flow from the vernacular or the regional newspapers, and not just the newspapers, but also just the informal networks through which information flows, that has moved into, bigger city newspapers and then television networks as well. And so there is a sort of ecology, if you will, of how crime stories, and stories generally, not just crime, but the language and the imagery and the kind of stickiness, if you will, that a story is sort of looking for, right? It depends on the language and the imagery that people are enticed by or excited by, up and down the line. And you're absolutely right that we have a very top down sort of view of this, but the fact is that if we look to these non-metropolitan areas where the language and imagery of crime is very different from, perhaps, or not very different from, but is steeped in or connected to cultural and social symbols and imagery that is different from, say, a city like Delhi or Bombay, we find some of the clues perhaps for, where the crime reporting sort of comes from. And again, Dhanya and I have spoken about this before, about, what makes a crime story stick is very often the fact that it has a certain sort of a symbolic value for a particular region, where it may not have the same kind of pull or publicity in another area. And so, Dhanya, I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about the kind of thing that you've seen, because you have moved from what is sort of, like a national level channel to more sort of regional based reporting, and you might have seen these differences. So, if you could speak to that a little bit.
So, a couple of things here, Amrita. Like Hartosh was saying, um, it is mainly the regional newspapers, the regional television channels that people depend on. Like, for example, the five states that I cover, Kannada, Telugu, Malayalam, Tamil. These are the newspapers and the channels and the websites in these languages. This is where people primarily consume their news from. And in most of these places, I think the situation is much worse than what it is in English media, especially when it comes to covering crimes or issues related to children and women. There are only very few issues in which most of these organizations take a liberal viewpoint. For example, the Me Too movement, the kind of coverage that Tamil media, for example, gave, I think was a huge step back for the movement itself. Now, another thing I would like to bring in is that I personally feel crime reporting and consumption of crime reporting by the general public is no longer from mainstream media. They are not reading about crimes from newspapers or television channels, but they're depending upon YouTube channels. In fact, if you see, the consumption of crime stories on YouTube channels is really high. These are run by private individuals, and each video would have like 10 lakh views, 30 lakh views. And some of this content is so transphobic, is so much of against women, children. I mean, you name it, the problems are there. For example, recently there was a case from Coimbatore in Tamil Nadu where a student had died by suicide. She had left behind a suicide note blaming her teachers and several others. Now, while covering this, it was a huge story for at least 2, 3 days. All YouTube channels put out her pictures, her name. So there is absolutely no sensitization of what the law says, of what are the rules they're supposed to follow. And the Coimbatore police commissioner was forced to give defamation notices to at least 30 YouTube channels. So we are talking about a world beyond mainstream media itself where crime reporting is happening. Sometimes these YouTube channels are run by former journalists, sometimes not. I think the organizational sensitization which has to be happening in mainstream media is on one side. But if we are going to talk about the damage that is being done by consumption of this kind of voyeurism by the general public, I think we should also start addressing what is happening on those channels which are outside the so-called mainstream media.
Yeah. So this becomes then a much larger question, of course, which is, to do with not just regulation of specific networks or specific corporations where there are media corporations, but it becomes this larger question about how do we both talk about and represent women, children, minorities, LGBTQ communities, etc. And then it's sort of part of the general struggles that we are all fighting, where then media is but one arm within that, right? And so this raises the question for me, which I'm always sort of curious to hear what journalists have to say, which is that, of course, it's not just journalism that is, the problem. It's they're both people within journalism who are trying to do something to make reporting and investigative long form writing better and more accountable, and also improve in terms of language and in terms of how certain stories are presented. But also, how do you sort of then go to those institutional issues that both you and Hartosh have raised, which is that how where to begin? Where does one begin correcting the ship or sort of righting the ship, so to speak? How does one start to build a better journalism? And then, of course, how does one try to contain, if possible, the damage that these other social media and digital media networks can create? Because they can allow for a story to just gallop away and become something completely different, because these are algorithmic forces that take a story and make it into all kinds of other forces and effects. Now, we've seen this done very successfully in cases of things like love jihad, or even in the case of terror cases, where it is these networks that lie outside something like a traditional news media format, that have created vigilante violence, or they've created violence against specific communities. We saw this in Delhi, in 2020. So how does one begin addressing what are these clearly really interlinked issues, but also really big issues where violence and the persuasive power of media and all of these things are sort of all linked together? And I recognize that that might be a huge question. So please feel free to break it down in any which way you want.
So I believe that we need to first deal with what's happening in news organizations, because mostly your YouTube channels and the other players take their cue from media organizations. So how will media organizations deal with it? It has to be systemic. The organization should have its own values. It should have perhaps a style sheet, like we at the News Minute, we have a very strict style guide. And it has to be a continuous process. No reporter or no journalist is going to be with the organization forever. So if someone quits in 6 months or 3 years and a new person comes in, it is the organization's responsibility to ensure that every single person working there understands these values, understands that this is a style guide, this is the limit that we will never cross, this is how we will do crime reporting. That, for example, a story like a Riya Chakraborty or an Aryan Khan breaks out. What are the lines that we will not cross, despite the fact that that brings you the most clicks or the views or readership? How will you look at that story? Are we going to, as an organization, think that malign drug consumption, or do we have a stand on that? These are things that every organization has to decide. And depending on that, every story has to be treated that way. But like I said, sometimes it becomes difficult for organizations to continuously do it because the news cycle keeps them busy. In my own organization, I can tell you, we have a strict policy not to name the child, or not to name the victim in any crime, and also not to name any identifiers. For example, if a child is studying in a specific school, but then we had to change that policy because people started asking, why don't you name the school? Why are you not naming the school here? How will people know? Or, for example, when the school itself is complicit in the crime, then how do you leave their name out? So then there should be a thought process involved. Are there
Mhm.
cases where you name the school? Are there cases where you do not name the school? So I think every organization needs to be proactive in understanding how they report crimes, and also in sensitizing their reporters. Because I completely agree with Harsh that the onus is on the organization, not on individuals.
Mhm, mhm. Hartosh, was there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, because I mean, it's a very large question, and I think some of it
Mhm,
has been addressed by Dhanya. But as soon as we get into these issues, we move beyond the actual questions of the kind of norms that we have to follow for reporting crime, not identifying victims of a certain kind, be sensitized to what legal proceedings are, everything that we would normally lay down. We are also looking at why what happens does happen. And in India, we are in a peculiar situation. As far as institutions are concerned, how do you operate in an environment where often government itself tends to be a criminal enterprise?
exactly.
And I am being rather frank.
Mhm,
You are reporting Kashmir. You are
mhm,
reporting the anti-Muslim violence in Delhi. You are reporting what happened with the farmers in Lakhimpur Khedi. These are crimes.
mhm.
The government actually wants you to report these crimes in the same sensational way that the vernacular has, in a certain voyeuristic, slanted fashion which favors the government's version. So, all the institutional safeguards fail when institutions are rewarded for violating them by the government itself. So, that is where your institutions tend to start falling apart. If they see this happening in these cases, they are going to do this in every case.
Exactly.
The second is the proliferation of what Danya so rightly said, of YouTube channels, Twitter handles, whatever. The individualization of journalism, the cult of individuals, personalities, is actually a huge problem, despite what we may think, because a YouTube channel which is doing this to sensationalize something, an individual doing this, is actually totally dependent on the police for information. When it comes to serious issues, what you will find is that it is always the police version that will prevail. The sensational twist will be the sensational twist that serves the police well in terms of their own publicity or in terms of going to court, whatever it is. The and the ability of individuals to resist that kind of pressure is almost impossible if you don't have institutions behind him. So I think we are operating in a larger environment where we have this fragmentation of journalism into individuals. So we are talking of larger problems. And the second is this: we have
Mhm,
a government which itself is coming close to a criminal enterprise. Caught
mhm.
between these two, when we look at crime reporting, it sort of exemplifies both these trends.
That's right. I'm so glad actually that you raised the, I guess the irony is a sort of mild way of putting it. But here we are, it is indeed the case that when one reports on certain kinds of crimes in India, it is not just that you might also be caught up reporting against a government or very powerful individuals specifically within government, where the government is, or bureaucrats and government are in fact criminal, but where also, like you said, institutions fall apart because they are rewarded for upholding violence that those that government has perpetrated. There's another thing that I have often thought about in the case of what counts as crime too, right? Which is also, I think, what you're sort of pointing to, Hartosh, with that question of, when the government is itself criminal, then who says what the crime is, and who says what the crime is. In There is of course this question of, when you're reporting on Kashmir, or when you're reporting on, anti-Muslim or anti minority violence in India, but there are also things like, rape or sexual assault. What is sexual assault for one party is not for another party, right? So there was this excellent three-part series report that had come out in the Hindu some years ago. I think that the journalist was maybe Rukmini Srinivasan, and she had gone through, numerous FIRs where what the police had registered as rape was in fact consensual sex between a young woman and her chosen lover, but not sanctioned by her parents. So she was then forced to go to the police station and register that case as rape, right? So in that kind of situation, it becomes very does it not become very difficult to even talk about what a crime is, when in fact what one is looking at is the operation of social and in some cases legal norms that are themselves violent. And so, in that sort of instance, what are we even looking at when we're looking at something like crime reporting, and how should journalists go about, I guess, educating themselves on the question of what are we looking at when we're looking at something like sexual assault, or what are we looking at when we're looking at something like this question of love jihad or terrorism, right? Because all of these cases tend to become a question of whose side are you looking at it from. And then this the question of accountability and being held to some kind of a standard only matters if realized, I guess, if you have someone who is willing to see that as a problem.
See, the question is who shall monitor or who shall be judge in a country where the government itself has evaded that duty? It becomes impossible that all organizations will monitor themselves. In terms of the kind of sensitization that you're talking about, this has almost become a daily problem. It has pervaded institutions. Just talking of questions of sexual assault, despite the law and legality being very clear, we are looking at a country where a certain kind of bias in terms of how you view these crimes is institutional. I think we have seen the Supreme Court recently correct uh, some Bombay High Court judgments on what kind of contact constitutes molestation or
Mm-hmm.
harassment or sexual violence. We've seen recently Allahabad High Court judgment, which will definitely go to the Supreme Court, where a sentence has been diluted because oral sex does not
Mm-hmm.
constitute, etc. So we are talking of a country where often, in terms of how justice is administered, often social norms which are regressive become part of the process in themselves. And whatever the law, the constitution itself may say, they tend to have a huge influence on the outcomes. And this pervades not just the legal enforcement system, it runs into journalism and the people who consume journalism and who produce journalism. In such an environment, what we are talking of, the kind of restraint and control that we are talking of, already is the domain of a minority that must hold up values that are not reasonably seen as desired by a huge part of the country's population. And in this, if you do not have the backing of a government that tends to believe in these values, you are going to see the kind of anarchy that we are seeing, with the worst results in areas where the victims are most vulnerable. So, in gender crimes, in crimes against minorities, it is here that the bias, social bias, governmental bias, will get reflected in the media most and will get exaggerated. I mean, doubly victimizing them in some senses.
As Hartosh was speaking about crimes against minorities, I think that's a completely different topic altogether that we have to look at more deeply. For example, I have been speaking about crimes against women and children mostly, but crimes
Mm-hmm.
against minorities, look, in the last few years, the the kind of reporting by a section of the media, I would say, is downright scary, and it
Mm-hmm.
does not induce any kind of confidence in the minority groups to approach these media groups. Because, I mean, when a crime happens, most times people do approach the media because they believe that they would be part of that fight to get justice, right? But many media houses, under pressure from the government, or even because they agree with the government's ideology and viewpoint, they themselves are party to what the government believes in. Therefore, the kind of reporting is so skewed, and we are seeing the outcome of that almost every day now. And also, I think more than the damage which is done by reporting certain crimes against minorities in a certain way, more damage is being done by not reporting a lot of this.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of things that are happening against minorities is being swept under the carpet. There is absolutely no conversation about it in a large section of the mainstream media. And it remains largely on Twitter, on social media, or WhatsApp platforms, and then it gets skewed in many manner. But the fact that the government does control a lot of the media narrative is being reflected quite a bit in crime reporting, which includes sensational crimes, which includes
Mm-hmm.
crimes against minorities. and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. But there are a few players who are sort of challenging that status quo, which is of course refreshing, but that's simply not enough, because the larger section of the media is still I would say towing the government's line and sort of remaining quiet on a lot of crimes happening against minorities across the country.
Right. I might want to sort of take us towards an end, which might not be the most hopeful one, but I want to ask this very bald question because given that we have discussed how in the case of reporting and in the case of being a journalist in India today, it is true that the government, both at the center and in many states, is not sympathetic to the kind of journalism that both you, Dhanya, and you, Hartosh, have been talking about. I would ask this very simply. Do you think it is dangerous to be a journalist in India today?
Look, I think it's a pretty broad question. It also depends on where you are and what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think if you are in small towns, small places, or even district headquarters, the places like I was naming, and you're taking on powerful people, there are extreme dangers both from the government and from the individuals who can clamp down you in physically violent ways as well. And that's a given. And we have examples across. Certainly, the Hindi bill, Dhanya will be able to give other
Mm-hmm.
examples of people being picked up, arrested for reporting on various issues in ways that the government or local authorities or local individuals who are powerful do not want. But
Mm-hmm.
if you talk of journalists, for example, in places like Delhi, Bombay, in the large metros, I think that this danger, as far as I'm personally, of course it exists, and I think we have Gauri Lankesh's case to sort of cite, is that largely exaggerated. We institutionally have collapsed before actually the kind of threats that we are anticipating have materialized. I
Mm-hmm.
know of very few journalists in Delhi who face any actual practical danger in terms of reporting. I
Right.
have not encountered it. So I don't think that can be the reason for us not doing it. There may be institutional dangers of the government clamping down. Even those are rare and few examples that they are meant to send a certain message out. If we
Mm-hmm.
try and bend down to that message, then we have failed in our job. So in the end, the onus does come back on us as individuals and the institutions. That when you raise the question of the kind of journalism, I don't think there are kinds of journalism. We have a certain, it's, there can't be kinds of policing or kinds of medicine. We have certain norms and certain ways in which we go out
Right.
and report with certain constraints, certain set of practices that we must follow. The point is,
Mm-hmm.
it is up to us to maintain it even if we are in a minority, and hope that that example spreads. We have to make sure we hold others who are not doing it, including other media organizations, which is why I think it's important for media to report on other media covering crime and other
Mm-hmm.
issues as well, to hold that up to scrutiny and hope that eventually in larger society, in terms of the government we have and the people we have, that good sense prevails. Till then, we have to keep doing what we can.
Right. This is the sort of the watchdog quality of journalism that I think, in the early 2000s, Indian media had really sort of taken that to heart. Certainly Tehelka had in its early days done that. NDTV had done that. And I think that in some ways it may have gone a little bit off the rails in terms of the sting operations and things like that. But the idea very much was that with a set of objective values, that this is what journalism is good for, and that it can hold powerful people to account, right? With that in mind, that was sort of like the start of independent journalism in India, right? Like outside of government control and things like that. And perhaps it was always in a minority. Perhaps it has always been a question of being in a minority. But as you say, the work has to go on, and it's a matter of holding others within the professional field of journalism also accountable, and sort of holding their feet to the fire to make them do better. Do you see that as, and just some last words here, do you see that as something that has perhaps in your smaller fields now? Because Dhanya, you have the News Minute that does some really excellent reporting. Hartosh, of course, the Caravan has made its space in long form journalism. Do you see that? What would you sort of say if you were to take the temperature of these sorts of organizations here in India in terms of being websites or physical magazines? Where do you think the trend is? Are there more such organizations and people who are willing to step out and do this work?
I think as far as English goes, no, we are stagnated there. Um, but in languages other than English, I do see a glimmer of hope. For example, Malayalam or Tamil, they do
Hmm.
much better journalism than I think the English guys can ever uh, talk about or boast about. But um, it, of course, remains restricted within their states. And I think it also depends upon what the politics of the state has been, what are the kind of politicians that you have in the state, etc. And also what kind of governments are in power. Before this, Amrita, I just want to quickly just agree to one point that Hartosh made, which you asked him that is it dangerous to be a journalist in India? I mean, there is some danger while doing journalism. There's some danger while you do certain stories or where your organization does certain stories. But I don't think largely it is dangerous to be a journalist. For example, I
Hmm.
don't, I'm sitting in my house now, I will go to my office in some time. Is it dangerous for me to walk on the road? No, I don't think so. I mean,
Right.
there would be some threat specific story or two, but that's about it. I think the real problem is that a lot of journalists believe that there is a big danger out there and they self censor. That is
Hmm.
a big danger I feel to journalism. The journalists believing that in the that there could be a future threat or there could be a future problem, therefore we have to self censor, and that future threat or problem can come in different ways. It need not be physical threat. It can be a threat of defamation. It can be a threat that you could find yourself in jail, or the government or whoever foisting cases against you. So that threat of something
Hmm.
happening in the future is definitely making a lot of journalists and organizations self censor, which I feel is the biggest danger to journalism.
Right. So it is having a chilling effect, which is sort of putting both yours and your point and Hartosh's point together. Journalists might be overstating the threat to themselves and anticipating those threats and therefore self-censoring, which is a greater sort of chilling effect, which needs to be pushed back against.
I agree entirely with Dhanya on that. It's simply, I
Mhm.
mean, that we keep hearing that same statement over and over again about the emergency they crawl when they were asked to bend. I think in this case, we
Right.
are crawling even when we've not been asked to bend. I mean, it is literally that the fear of being asked to bend is making people crawl, and that's just
Right.
basically a problem with how we are doing our jobs.
Right. I think we could wrap it up there, perhaps. Thank you both so much for joining me on this podcast and for talking about all of these issues. I think it's a really interesting state of the field, so to speak, or state of the profession, that in India we are now sort of we've reached a point where we can say that we have done our jobs well as journalists in the past, and it's a matter of keeping ourselves honest and keeping ourselves writing and keeping ourselves investigating and just keeping on doing what good journalism is. And there's no other way to do it than to just do it. So thank you so much, both of you, for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you very much, Amrita, for having us.
Thank you. Thank you, Amrita. Thank you.